Good afternoon and welcome to the concluding session of the conference. My name is Shikha, Dalmia, and I'm a fellow at the Mercatus Center and editor of a new Substack publication called the Unpopulist that studies the rise of populist authoritarianism around the globe. If you want to be more depressed about the state of liberalism in the world, this is your publication. But for the record, I did not arrange to knock out Andrew Sullivan from this panel because he runs a more popular Substack than mine, and replace him with Ross Douthat, who writes for an obscure publication called the New York Times that I'm sure no one has heard about. Andrew had a prolonged bout of COVID and so had to voluntarily bow out. This is the last panel from of the conference, but not the least, given that its topic is, does liberalism have a future? This question that would have resulted in puzzled looks and furrowed brows a decade ago doesn't seem that weird anymore. The stunning speed at which it has become relevant is in itself a remarkable phenomenon. And we have three excellent panelists to address this question. In order of appearance, they are, first, Matthew B Crawford, who is both a philosopher and a mechanic, currently a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He used to operate Shopper, an independent motorcycle repair shop in Richmond, Virginia. He's the author of several books, including Shopcraft as Soulcraft, which is a New York Times bestseller and Frank Fukuyama's personal favorite. Bill Galston, who holds Ezra K. Zulkut Chair in Governance Studies and is a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. Bill has written extensively both about the causes of the decline of liberalism and what to do about it. In addition to being amazingly prolific, I can personally testify that Bill is also a man of iron constitution who can attend a 3-day conference in California, take a red-eye to Detroit, and then within an hour attend a whole day of conference without missing a beat. And finally, we go to Ross Douthat, the New York Times resident Catholic conservative columnist. Ross is the author of several books and has the rare gift of writing empathetically and generously about positions he disagrees with and forces those who disagree with him to take his positions more seriously. He's also the hero of this conference because he agreed last minute to step in for Sullivan and made a second trip to Michigan in a week, in April. All the panelists have democratically agreed to make a radical change to the format of this panel. Each is going to confine his opening remarks to merely 15 minutes, after which each will get 5 minutes to respond to the others before opening to question and answer from the audience. And I will repeat this later, but audience, please wait for the mic to ask your question, and if possible, stand up.
Okay. First, I just want to note that these two other guys both have full tumblers of scotch, and all I've got is lemonade, so I feel at a disadvantage. I'll try to summon my higher sobriety. So there's a hyphen in the term liberal democracy, and lately we've been finding out that the hyphen was doing a fair bit of work in holding our regime together. I think it's maybe because it's founded on two rival anthropologies. The first regards us as rational, self-governing creatures. You can call this picture Lockean, maybe. It locates reason in a common human endowment, common sense, more or less, and underwrites a basically democratic or majoritarian form of politics. There are no esoteric secrets to governing. The second rival picture of the human subject, and you can call this Hobbesian, insists we are irrationally proud and in need of being governed. I'll have more to say about that later. This picture of the human subject is more hortatory than the first. It needs us to think of ourselves as vulnerable, so the state can play the role of saving us. It underwrites a technocratic, progressive form of politics. I'm going to argue that we've abandoned the first anthropology and thrown in with the second Bayesian one, and that looking at COVID culture through this lens can help us see that the recent damage to, or let us hope, merely suspension of some of those good old Lockean principles of democratic government coincides with the fulfillment of liberal anthropology of the Bayesian sort. So I'm just taking a quick tour through the recent past before talking about the present, and the point of this quick tour through the recent past is to establish that the Lockean anthropology has been quietly put to bed. The 90s saw the rise of new currents in the social sciences that emphasized the cognitive incompetence of human beings. The rational actor model of human behavior was a simplistic premise that had underwritten the party of the market for the previous half-century. It was deposed by the more psychologically informed school of behavioral economics, which teaches that our actions are largely guided by pre-reflective cognitive biases and heuristics. This was a necessary revision in our picture of the human person in the direction of realism, but with political consequences I think we can be ambivalent about. It gave us the nudge, a non-coercive way to alter people's behavior without having to persuade them of anything. It'd be hard to overstate the degree to which this approach has been institutionalized on both sides of the Atlantic. The innovation achieved here at scale is in the way government conceives its subjects, not as citizens whose considered consent must be secured, but as particles to be steered through a science of behavior management that relies on our pre-reflective biases. So much, then, for the Enlightenment idea that in a liberal society, governing authority is to be grounded in our shared rationality, accessible to every citizen and capable of articulation. Technocratic progressivism, in fact, requires the disqualification of experience and common sense as a guide to reality, and installs in their place a basically priestly form of authority, closer to the Enlightenment's caricature of medieval society than to its own self-image. We're recalled to the fact that liberalism and democracy are two distinct things, not entirely at ease with one another. Their differences were submerged during the Cold War when they had a common enemy in Soviet communism, just as they had been submerged previously when they had a common enemy in monarchy. When monarchy was finally eliminated as a rival to democracy in the revolutions of 1848, the alliance of convenience between liberalism and democracy threatened to break down. By 1861, John Stuart Mill was terrified that democratic majorities would constrain a liberalism consisting of experiments in living. The basic problem was that such a liberatory project gets its political legitimacy by allying itself with democracy, first against monarchy and then against communism. When the latter disappeared, the solution hit upon by liberals was to shore up the legitimating alliance, was to offer an idealized concept of democracy, sharply distinguished from mere majoritarianism. By this device, the liberal may get to preserve his self-understanding as a Democrat. So the hot career track for my cohort of PhD students in the political science department at Chicago in the 90s was to build up a theoretical edifice to strengthen the hyphen in liberal democracy, kind of like Ptolemy's addition of epicycles and other intricacies in an effort to save the geocentric model of the solar system in an effort to save it from an accumulating body of observation. The political theorists of my generation did this under a rubric they called deliberative democracy. And it wasn't my bag. I know about it mostly from hearsay. And I'm sure Bill will correct me if I'm getting this wrong. My understanding is that there was a quarrel at the time between Habermas and Rawls. And it was Rawls, the would-be priest, as Eric Nelson told us yesterday. It was Rawls who insisted on this crucial point. If you could just establish the right framing conditions for deliberation, the demos would arrive at acceptably liberal positions. We should be able to formalize these conditions, it was thought. And conversely, wherever the opinions of the demos depart from an axis running roughly from the editorial page of the New York Times to that of the Wall Street Journal, it was taken to be prima facie evidence that there was some distorting influence in the discursive conditions under which people were conducting their thought processes or their conversations among themselves. The result was an opinion that was not authentically democratic, that is, not liberal. Obviously, the prospect of populism was already causing some anxiety. Propping up liberal democracy as a conceptual unity would require a cadre of subtle dialecticians working at a meta level on the formal conditions of thought, nudging the populace through a cognitive framing operation to be conducted beneath the threshold of explicit argument. I remember there was one grad student in my department who was running experiments on focus groups, seeing if he could get them to think the right thoughts. I don't know if he succeeded in that, but I have little doubt that he got them to say the right thoughts, and thereby lend those thoughts the demotic imprimatur he was looking for. Maybe that was good enough. Political correctness might be understood as a device that became sorry. All right.
This reminds me of what Adam is reported to have said to me.
Yes.
My dear, you seem to be missing a leaf.
All right. Political correctness might be understood as a device that became necessary for liberalism to continue to claim the mantle of democracy, even as prosecution of its program would require increasingly anti-democratic measures. As it turns out, the best way to secure the discursive conditions for deliberative democracy and install a proper choice architecture that will nudge the demos in the right direction is to curate information. Soon, the internet would both enable and undermine these aspirations. The enabling stage is represented by the intimate collaboration between Google and the Obama White House. Hundreds of people switch jobs back and forth between the administration and this one firm over the course of Obama's 2 terms in an unprecedented alliance of executive and corporate power. But this aspiration to nudge the populace through the management of information failed badly in 2016 and has been ever since, leading to real panic in the ruling class. We've been under a declared state of emergency ever since, in which the principles of democratic governance look like an unaffordable luxury. The pandemic arrived at just this moment. Let me be clear, I'm not suggesting a conspiracy in which it's a fake pandemic conjured for political purposes. Rather, COVID found its meaning and acquired its normative force from an antecedent political metaphysic that I'm trying to describe. A fearful public acquiesced to an extraordinary extension of expert jurisdiction over every domain of life. Note that fear was key. That's what's going to bring us back to Hobbes in a moment. Notoriously, polling indicated that perception of the risks of COVID outstripped the reality by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude, but with a sharp demarcation. The 100-fold distortion was among self-identified liberal Democrats, that is, those whose yard signs exhort us to believe in science. The word belief here is telling. Here, science is not something falsifiable, to use Popper's phrase for distinguishing science from religion. Recall the fable of Galileo brought before the Inquisition, so often repeated in the liturgy of enlightenment. On one side, you have authority, whether political or ecclesiastical. On the other side, you have science, a mode of inquiry that stands for freedom of the mind and is at odds with the very idea of authority. Today's science is pressed into duty as authority. It's invoked to legitimize a transfer of sovereignty from democratic to technocratic bodies, and as a device for insulating such transfers from political contest under the banner of emergency. And this brings us back to Hobbes. Hobbes offers a fable, the state of nature, according to which we are originally in a condition of acute vulnerability. Civil war is a possibility that is always latent, and is the problem this politics is meant to solve. The problem is that we are prone to pride, or vainglory, or ornery. And this is based on a false consciousness, in which we place too high a value on ourselves. The good news is that such spiritedness can be overcome through a shift in perspective. If we come to identify with the weak rather than think ourselves strong, we are all potential victims. And this is the self-awareness that grounds political authority in consent. It's fear that makes us consent to Leviathan, whom Hobbes called king of the proud.
Shall I try another joke?
Yes, please. I got it. Give me the time. All right. So, liberalism then begins with the politics of emergency. Leviathan is supposed to end the state of emergency. That's the whole point of it. But the emergency must be renewed over and over again if Leviathan is to thrive. This requires the cultivation of a certain kind of self-consciousness, that of the vulnerable self. This is the guy you see riding his bicycle double-masked. It's the self that is implicit in the cult of safetyism that children are brought up in. A therapeutic parastate arose early in the 20th century and was well described by Christopher Lasch. It has long required fragile selves, more as clients than as citizens. With the rise of the biosecurity state, this demand has taken on a new dimension. I should say where I'm coming from. I live in the Bay Area, the deepest blue region in the country. So I may be responding to different social facts than the rest of you are observing where you live. Right now, I'd say fully a quarter of the people walking around Berkeley are masked outdoors. And I'm just going to assume they're all fully vaxxed and boosted. So I want to try to understand this, because whatever it is not following the science. One can be charitable and acknowledge that many of our hygiene maximalists are acting not out of fear for themselves, but in the name of the common good. And this is attractive. Indeed, deep blue COVID culture might be seen as a reaction prompted by dissatisfaction with liberal individualism. We have unsatisfied longings for belonging, for anything that could pull us out of the liberal mindset of rights and recall us to duties. The pandemic provided an opportunity to rise above the selfish concerns of the bourgeois and discover some public spiritedness in oneself. Zero COVID is a heroic battle, to join which requires a literal effacement of the individual. As in any war, those who have answered the call recognize one another, not by their faces, but by their uniform, the N95. There's a cult-like quality to public spaces in the Bay Area. One may efface oneself not out of fear, but out of identification with the vulnerable one who is currently elevated, the immunocompromised. Note that in this Hobbesian dynamic, the politics of emergency is intimately tied to victimology. That might help us to understand how in the summer of 2020, the moral emergency of white supremacism and the health emergency of COVID seem to merge into a single thing. And again, you don't need a conspiracy here. It's sufficient to have a shared political morality that sacralizes the victim. There's another way COVID culture reflects the state of liberalism. The medical morality of social distancing might be regarded as a heightened version of the late liberal condition, in which intermediary institutions that situate the individual in associations with others are badly eroded. Hannah Arendt found such atomization to be among the conditions that give rise to totalitarian movements. In the absence of a shared world, we latch onto Ersat's sources of solidarity, and the party offers just this. Disconnected individuals coalesce into a mass. Her analysis suggests liberal individualism has latent in it a tendency to totalitarianism. The lockdowns kicked this atomization to a level we've never seen before. With little shared material existence to provide an intersubjective anchor, we found what solace we could in disembodied, highly mediated interaction online. Screen time rose dramatically for all demographics. But such interaction tends toward the feedback loops and brittleness of merely verbally constituted tribes who have no skin in the game because they lack the shared pragmatic interests of those who inhabit the real world together. 2 more minutes. The common good, the good invoked by our hygiene maximalists, was that of health. But not health considered broadly, which would require an accounting of the health costs of lockdowns. And there's a very vigorous or empirical debate about the relative costs of lockdowns versus the virus itself. And my point here isn't to litigate these factual questions, which are contested, but I do want to register the lack of curiosity about them. And note that among those who identify as liberals, there seems to be little interest in such an accounting, which would seem to be crucial. The real attachment seems to be not to actual health, but to a source of collective meaning that floats free of the empirical, and that is the COVID emergency itself. The good that was invoked to generate collective meaning, namely preventing death, was made to trump all other goods, and in particular, those of human connection. I want to close by noting that pride, or better, thumos, spiritedness, is the part of the soul that assigns value to things, creating the field for moral choice. Fukuyama, in his first book, has an outstanding discussion of this. Thumos is the faculty that allows us to apprehend the world in its true colors under the sign of good and bad, and indeed a hierarchy of competing goods. For example, it's good to hold the hand of your mother as she lies dying, and you'd likely be angry with yourself if you fail to do this. What happens when the regime is one in which this spirited, evaluative activity is short-circuited, subordinating the distinctions that make for the good life to mere biological life, bare existence, that is, health as conceived by public health? In that case, our basic equipment for apprehending the world is negated. And that looks quite a bit to me like a consummation of the project to ground political authority in an attenuation of that spirited part of the soul. We might continue to call such a society liberal, and I've argued that we actually have some warrant for doing so. But I doubt it's one in which most of us want to live.
Well, thanks to begin with to all of the organizers of this wonderful event. And to make life easy for the belated third panelist, who hasn't had too much time to prepare, but perhaps his life has been a preparation. Is to say that what I'm about to say emerges out of a sustained encounter, as serious as I can make it, with the movement that now calls itself National Conservatism, a representative of whom you heard from yesterday. I want to ask and then respond to 4 questions. The first of which, the relevance may not be immediately clear, but I'll try to make it clear. The first question is this: what is political responsibility? And here's my answer. It is conducting oneself as though our words and deeds have weight. They can influence others. And that's particularly true in our encounters with students and young politicians. Second, we focus on the real alternatives before us. I have nothing against imagined principalities or of an image of perfection as a standard to guide choice among realistic alternatives, but we should never imagine that imagined perfection is in itself a serious practical alternative. Third, we begin from where we are. Fourth, to the greatest extent possible, we seek to preserve what is valuable in our inheritance, and improve upon the elements of that inheritance that are defective. We rarely, if ever, and certainly not in domestic politics, have the liberty or the opportunity of beginning with a blank slate. Right? There is no unconditional surrender in domestic politics. We never have an opportunity to remake ourselves in the way that we remade Germany and Japan after World War II. In this spirit, recent utterances on both sides of the aisle make me intensely uncomfortable. A leading progressive recently characterized the Constitution as, and I quote, trash, and then wrote a book to explain his judgment. A leading member, indeed one of the co-authors of the National Conservative Movement, has denounced the Declaration of Independence as a flight of fancy by a misguided Enlightenment rationalist with no connection to the Constitution or the American political tradition. Question number 2. I can answer this very quickly. I urge that we focus on the real alternatives before us. And here, in my judgment, is what they are. Liberal democracy in all of its variants, and I would include European social democracy within that family. Second, illiberal autocracy, and Victor Orban, you know what I'm talking about. Third, panoptic totalitarianism, under which a quarter of the world's population now labors. And fourth, unabashed theocracy. The National Conservative Movement is divided between the second and the fourth options, and in its sympathies reveals its orientation towards those two. Question number 3. If political responsibility means discharging to the best of our ability, improving what has been handed to us, being honest about its defects and resolute in trying to repair them, what can we do? Well, I have, in the spirit of Lorraine Pangel's presentation this morning, I have some modest proposals. One has to do with our parties, and the other has to do with our policies. And I'll preface the discussion of our parties with the proposition that every principle, every worthy principle, can be taken too far, including, dare I say it, the love of God. Every single principle can be taken too far. This applies to our political parties, which now exemplify this tendency in the spirit of perhaps not the letter of Tocqueville. I will say that our two political parties, we now have a party of equality and a party of liberty, and each goes too far in discernible respects. What is a defensible liberal democratic understanding of equality? Moral equality, equal weight to all human beings on one construction, and certainly all citizens on another. Civic equality, for sure. Equality of rights, equality of basic security, and equality of opportunity. What is excessive equality on this account? The belief that if we are equal in some respects, well, we are equal in all respects. That the inequality of gifts and talents, the inequality of merit, the inequalities of character, none of these matter. These are not useful and defensive distinctions, but forms of discrimination that must be swept away. And I would add the willingness to restrict liberty in the name of this over-expansive conception of equality. On the other hand, what is the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate forms of liberty? Well, a legitimate form of liberty is, in our tradition, I think properly so, rights-based, autonomy-based, the ability to chart one's own path in life. An equality of privacy, a protected zone within which we may act without political interference, and I think that protected zone is the essence of liberalism as I understand it. The antithesis of liberal, the phrase liberal democracy, is not conservative democracy, it is total democracy, that is to say unfettered majoritarianism, just to make that definition clear. What is excessive liberty on my account? It is a level of self-assertion and self-preference that excludes responsibilities to others. Don't tread on me is a fine slogan for a snake, less eligible as a suitable slogan for a liberal democratic citizen. It's easy to downplay it's easy to focus on the excesses of the other side, and it's harder to stand against the excesses of one's own side. But this, on my account, is one of the things that political responsibility, rightly understood, requires of us all, now more than ever. So much for the parties. What about our policies? To ameliorate the defects of liberal democracy as it is now practiced. Here, in the spirit of malice for none and charity for all, I will direct my comments to my own side. How much time?
5.
5.
A little more than 5.
Okay. First of all, I'll call myself a political liberal as distinct from a philosophical liberal, because political liberals and political conservatives in this country, for the most part, subscribe to philosophical liberalism as a basic frame for our political institutions. The national conservatives don't. So, to my fellow political liberals, first, we must take religious free exercise seriously. Find ways of accommodating free exercise claims, including many that make us uncomfortable. I would say that both the Party of Equality and the Party of Liberty have failed to take religious free exercise and maximum feasible accommodation seriously. I note for the record that the most anti-accommodationist Supreme Court decision in our history was written by Edmund Scalia. Second piece of advice, we must minimize public interference with illiberal civil associations and illiberal businesses. I can see the argument that led at least one state to forbid Catholic adoption agencies to operate on the grounds that they refuse to place potential adoptees with same-sex families. I can see that argument. I think it is on various levels a mistake. Similarly, I can see the arguments that might lead one to require a Christian baker to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. My head has sympathy for those arguments, but my political heart tells me that that's not the right thing to do. Third, we have to try to denationalize whenever possible policies that we are always tempted to bring to the national level, because in circumstances of deep diversity and deep disagreement, nationalizing problems inevitably means homogenizing solutions, requiring the same thing of everybody. We have resources in the liberal democratic tradition to take federalism and localism seriously, and I think we have to avail ourselves of them. And I would add, wherever possible, mute the conflict by reducing the perimeter of the public. There are some things that are necessarily public, like the financing of public education, especially for families of extremely limited means. Is it equally essential that the public authority that finances education must also provide education? You know, is there room for a model that does the first but not the second? How far can that model be taken? Would it mute some of the conflicts over public education that are now racking our country, and I would say disfiguring our politics? In sum, I say in that assembling vein, we need liberal remedies for the diseases most incident to liberal communities. Fourth and final, I've very briefly sketched a liberalism that focuses on the fact, and to some extent on the value, of plurality and diversity. So I have to ask myself the fourth and final question. Does liberalism so understood leave enough agreement on fundamentals to contain our differences within a shared common frame? Some of my critics have accused me of propounding a kind of soft anarchism in the name of liberal diversity and plurality. So let me conclude with two optimistic suggestions. First of all, I think that beneath our disagreement, there is what I'll call a shared liberal teleology among Americans. And that is the importance of developing the diverse talents and gifts that we as human beings are given. The question is not what we are given, but what we do with what we are given, and whether we have an opportunity to make the most of what we are given. There is a slogan, I think it's still used by an organization that's still in existence, I checked, called the United Negro College Fund, and the slogan is, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." And I think most Americans agree with that proposition. And that's this idea of what might be called, plural teleology, where we are very, very different, but what we have in common is the fact that a good life is hard to attain without developing the gifts and talents with which we're endowed. I think that's a basis for agreement that could take us pretty far. Second, and this is the most optimistic I'm going to be today, I am really struck by Americans' reactions to the invasion of Ukraine. It has been as close to uniform. This is the last 30 seconds. It has been as close to uniform across lines of ideology and partisan affiliation as I've seen in all of my decades as a make-believe empirical political scientist. There's agreement on the practical level about what we should do and what we shouldn't do as a country and as a people, to aid the Ukrainians in their struggle. But there's also a moral agreement, an agreement about what's right and what's wrong, an agreement about what is virtuous in a leader and in a people, and what is vicious, and an agreement on what kind of conduct is decent and what kind of conduct is abhorrent. This may be just an island of agreement, but I think that we can...
That was not my
it's important to take it seriously and ask ourselves, are we as fundamentally divided as we think we are? And if not, what kind of productive use can this moment of agreement be put to? Thank you.
Ross, if you might wait just a minute, just make sure the mic is on.
Memory. I don't think.
This one.
Is it? They may bring closer. All right.
Very good.
This is the end. I'm going to wrap it all up. I'm really grateful to be included, even or especially at the last minute, since it gives me an excuse to sit up here with these scattered notes framing my remarks, which promise even more bafflement than Matthew's pages. The last time I substituted for Andrew Sullivan, I've told a few of you, was about 15 years ago, when he was scheduled to debate the late Christopher Hitchens on the subject of God's existence. And he decided, for some reason, to get married that weekend instead. So I was dispatched to Nantucket, of all places, to take the side of God in a beachfront debate with Hitchens, where he sat with an actual glass of scotch, not this iced tea simulacrum, his shirt unbuttoned by several more buttons, and proceeded to rout the forces of religion and reduce me to reduce me to that effectively. So hopefully
He loses again.
that's right. God anyway. So it's a pleasure to fill in for Andrew once more. So let me try to sketch out what I see as three ways of thinking about the crisis, if it is a crisis of liberal democracy right now, and then, in the spirit of the framing of this discussion, offer a couple of potential futures where these crises might take us. So I think one way to think about the challenges facing our political order right now is to basically follow your framework, Matthew. To say that our system is supposed to be a liberal democracy, which in practice means the management of populist energies through some sort of structure of statesmanship and expertise. And part of what's happened in our society over the last few decades or the last couple of generations is that, in effect, populism has lost its connection to expertise, and expertise has lost its connection to the public that it aspires to rule. And this has happened for a variety of reasons, but the simplest simply has to do with changes to the economy and our sort of socioeconomic fabric that have led to an incredible self-segregation driven by meritocracy and other forces, and a kind of nationalization of the American elite, unprecedented in our history, that were manifest, I completely agree, in the response to COVID. I think Matthew has done a remarkable job of elaborating the difficulties with the sort of elite, upper meritocracy, party of the experts response as a resident of a not quite so stringent but pretty stringent part of Blue America. I agree with his characterization, but I think something is worth saying about the problems of the other part of the country, because a large part of the United States did not triple mask and follow the dictates of Anthony Fauci, or to the extent that they locked down or shut down or masked up, those policies were abandoned very quickly. And that part of America got a number of things right in terms of whether you want to keep schools open, how long you want to continue masking once you have a vaccine, things like this. But it itself also displays some of the weaknesses and defects of a sort of populism condition to reflexively distrust all expertise, which you could see manifest in just, for instance, differential vaccination rates nationwide. You can dig into and argue a little bit about variables in the numbers, but basically it does seem to be the case that populist America was vaccinated at unnecessarily low rates and died at unnecessarily high rates over the last year of the pandemic for reasons driven by the sort of reflexive populist mistrust and suspicion of all authority. And I think you saw this generally writ large throughout the Trump era, where the Trump derangement syndrome of the sort of expert and Mandarin class was matched by a lot of, frankly, deranged behavior within the Trump administration, driven by, again, this sort of populist, often conspiratorial temperament where, you know, trust the experts, believe the experts. The litany of the Mandarin class was matched by, you know, believe whatever you read on the internet, trust the conspiracy theories on the populist side. And that may seem like a harsh assessment, but I think it's worth offering to balance the entirely reasonable criticisms that we've heard of the sort of meritocratic Mandarin side of this divergence. And the result of this sort of divergence, which I think is manifest not just in the United States, but across the Western world, is a kind of ungovernability for liberal societies, where you have an expert class that is distrusted and feared by large segments of the population, which leads to populist rebellions, but then the populist rebels, once they're in office, well, often they aren't able to come to power, and to the extent that they are able to come to power, they find it extremely difficult to govern effectively, and so the cycle continues. So that's one challenge. The second challenge, and here I'll argue a tiny bit with Bill, I think liberalism is, you can see liberalism in two lights. One, as a system, a political system, a sort of minimalist political system that exists to manage religious and cultural disagreement, and second, as a kind of culture in its own right. And I think you characterize that culture pretty aptly. The sort of, you know, this one works, okay. I'll drop my vocal level slightly. As a culture that sort of follows John Locke's vision of the earth given to the rational and industrious, and sees this sort of, you know, fulfillment of human potential through market exchange and innovation as the kind of essence of a healthy culture and society. I don't think that's enough to unite a society, and I don't think it has actually been what has held together liberal society in the United States for, these many years. I think you need some thicker and, in the end, fundamentally religious culture, some sort of spiritual ghost inside the liberal political machine. And as I suggested in my slightly incoherent question in the last session, I think for most of American history, that was a form of ecumenical Protestantism. And since the 1960s, since the collapse of the Protestant mainline, we have lacked that kind of sort of shared religious consensus, shared religious center that provides a sort of a grounding, a common moral language, a framework for a lot of our debates. And what we have instead is a lot of different would-be candidates to fill that role that aren't sufficiently influential or unifying to actually take the place of the old Protestant mainline. And I think you can see the rise and partial fall of religious conservatism in this light, that there was sort of an attempt to create an ecumenical evangelical Catholic alliance that failed for various reasons to fill that sort of ecumenical Protestant void. And I think what we think of as identity politics or wokeness or sort of post-Protestant progressivism right now is still on sort of the ascending point of the arc, but suffers from a lot of the same deficiencies and ultimately is likely to fail in its turn. And I think the backlash that it is provoking in various regions all over the country is testament to its limits as a potential common moral and religious landscape. And in this sense, you know, the Garstinian choice that we keep talking about, Nietzsche or Catholicism, is sort of an extreme version of a kind of older American choice, which might be stated as Emerson or Protestantism, right? That's the sort of more American version of that choice. But the fact that so many very smart people are going to the more European version of that choice suggests that something has failed in American religious and spiritual culture that used to bind us together and now is pulling us apart. So that's the second challenge, the absence of a religious and moral common ground, even this perhaps thin common ground traditionally supplied by Protestantism. And then the third challenge is a sort of social destabilization that is downstream from technological and economic change. You know, you can think of this in political philosophical terms to say, look, you know, liberalism contains within itself genes that can be expressed under certain circumstances, right? And those circumstances, and let's say you have a gene towards radical individualism and the collapse of sort of community and familial bonds, that gene need not be expressed, but if you layer on the interstate highway system, the contraceptive pill, mass communications, and the internet and various other technological changes, that gene is expressed, and suddenly you have the decline of a lot of the social institutions, familial, religious, communal, and otherwise, that used to bind Americans in various ways together. And so, pushing forward from these three tendencies, the last one, a tendency towards a kind of radical atomization that maybe reaches its logical endpoint where we all live inside our own privately curated version of the metaverse. If you push forward, you would say, well, the first problem, this sort of experts versus populist problem, leads to a kind of permanent national gridlock punctuated by potential constitutional crises. That's sort of the political future for liberal democracy. The second challenge, the absence of a kind of religious or spiritual common ground, pushes you towards a sort of post-republic or a post-republican form of government. The term republic probably deserves its own set of panel discussions, but you would say basically without this kind of moral common ground, you tend towards a more imperial model of sort of managing very different sort of regional cultures and so on, although much of this might happen in the metaverse, so you would be managing different aspects of the metaverse, or you can think of it as not a republic, but a confederacy, a loose confederacy with a global peacekeeping force attached. That might be the American future. And then the final one, this sort of social destabilization, pushes you towards a kind of Brave New World scenario of immersive entertainments, designer drugs, stability maintained by constant technological surveillance and constant entertainment and distraction. And I don't know that in any of these futures there would come this sort of moment when, suddenly the American Putin ascends and you say, liberal democracy is, this is the moment when it ends. I think these processes are likely to be more gradual than that. But if you want to chart sort of dark American futures, that's sort of what I see. And now I probably have 30 seconds. 2 minutes for optimism. So, in terms of optimism, I would start by saying I agree with Bill that the conflict in Ukraine has been a minor but significant revelation of residual American unity, that as uncertain as we are about what we are still fairly certain about what we are not, and we are not, the sort of authoritarian nationalism of Putin's Russia. We are not the meritocratic totalitarianism of sort of the Chinese state at the moment. We aspire to be something else, something more distinctive. And I think that distinctive America, if you want to chart an optimistic future, would involve a recovery along the three dimensions that I've described. For our politics, it would require a left that became less academic and more democratic, that found a way to reconnect first with its own voters, the portions of the Democratic coalition that are not on board with sort of expert Mandarin rule. That was sort of the promise of the Biden candidacy that has evaporated somewhat in the Biden presidency. On the right, you would need the development of an actual class of
conservative leaders capable of real governance, which has not developed yet. I am more sympathetic to some of the national conservative efforts than Bill is, but I think that is zero. 30 more seconds. But I think somewhere out of right-wing intellectual ferment, you need a conservatism that can govern and not simply, pardon my language, shitpost its way through the next Republican administration. And finally, you need a restoration of community, which I think you can imagine developing in two ways. First, through a kind of selection effect, where in a context of destabilization, collapsing families and communities, collapsing birth rates, perhaps above all, over a multi-generational period, the families and communities and churches that survive this kind of winnowing will have found new ways of maintaining and managing an expanding community, and out of that you could draw recovery. And then finally, and this may be most important, no one is going to do away with the internet or the general technological transformations I've described, but in terms of our future as human beings in relation to each other, our families, and our politics, the crucial question is whether we will master these technologies or, as seems to be the case right now, pending Elon Musk's Twitter acquisition, be mastered by them, which seems to be a potential doom ultimately awaiting our society. So I'll leave things there. Thank you.
So, as previously agreed, each one will get 5 minutes to respond to the other. Just one quick note, I'm just going to assert my moderator's privilege. Like Ross and Bill, I'm very heartened with the American response to Ukraine. It seems like certain moral intuition has been dealing with. Let's not, underestimate sort of the top-down messaging that is necessary for this intuition to congeal. I mean, as the resident exemplar of Trump derangement syndrome, I can only imagine what the national sentiment had been if Trump has been president at this point rather than the current government.
A whole lot to say. Bill, to my mind, represents the most appealing kind of tradition of liberalism. And I'm at an age where nostalgia sets in. And if we could just go back to the 1980s or 90s, I'd be happy. So, in other words, kind of good old Lockean principles of government. And I suspect a lot of us malcontents might be content to crawl back into our holes and you never hear from us again if we could just go back a little bit. Because it feels like this more kind of Jacobin spirit that the Democratic Party is just deferred to. I don't know how much of that is due to kind of NGO organized funding or what, but it seems to me the Democratic Party, as Ross rightly says, needs to reclaim its connection to a much broader swath of voters, a kind of Christopher Lasch Democratic Party, maybe. And then the business of kind of a brave new world dystopia as a possible future, that strikes me as a pretty real hazard. I recently testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. It was an antitrust meeting, Klobuchar's committee, and argued that essentially we have a rival government within the territory of the United States, big tech that is, and that this body needs to basically reclaim sovereignty. I don't know what the prospects for that are. I'll stop there.
Well, you've got more time than us.
Well, first to Matt. You ended on a note with which I heartily agree as the author of a piece on revising our understanding of the logic of antitrust, going back to a form of antitrust enforcement that takes the civic dimension of power concentration and economic concentration seriously, and not just the consumer cost and benefit model that Robert Bork has imposed on our judicial system for too many decades. Just a a couple of other comments. First of all, Trump is not the only object of derangement in our politics. And I think it's wrong to suggest that it is, and I could name names if I wanted to, but I just want to put that point out there. You know, that to focus on TDS, you know, to the exclusion of the sources of derangement that are rampant, I would say, on the political right, is to offer an incomplete picture of American politics as it now stands. Secondly, I remember when the COVID epidemic first broke out, and there was a range of estimates as to how far it would be, how bad it would be. And way over on the pessimistic side was an Oxford model that predicted that 1.1 million Americans would die of COVID before the pandemic finally died out. Well, sometime in the next 2 months, we'll hit the million mark. And so what some people regard as an exaggerated response to the pandemic, I would say has been warranted not in every detail or every policy, but certainly in scope and in fear by the actual result of the pandemic. Now, if you want to contest that million figure and claim that it's exaggerated, then we have to have a different kind of argument.
No, but I would insist upon, to make that judgment that in every, not in every particular, but broadly, the lockdowns were warranted, and those are closing schools and masking of children and all that. One would have to do the accounting of the costs of that, and it's the lack of kind of interest in that that strikes me as indicative of something worrying. Yeah,
I agree. By the way, I agree with that, and and fear can be too great as well as too small. And I guess our two political parties divided along that axis as well. And we did not, hit the right point of equipoise, or so I would argue. To Ross's very interesting tripartite analysis, I think, and I'm not sure you would disagree with me, experts have done a pretty good job of delegitimizing themselves in the past 20 years. This has been, I believe, 20 years of misrule on both sides of the aisle, right? Entering into a major war on premises that turned out to be false. I don't think, I do not subscribe to a conspiracy theory on the origins of the Iraq War, but it was not good for the polity. That a seriously asserted claim justifying a major war just turned out to be wrong. Right? So the expertise of the military and the intelligence community were both called into doubt. Then the Great Recession and the response to it, which was characterized by both excess and deficiency, leaving a number of Americans who had the right to expect better high and dry. The mistaken belief of the Obama administration that don't do stupid shit was an adequate premise for a foreign policy. And then, of course, I would have a lot to say about the Trump administration as contributing to this crisis of expertise and crisis of power. So, I don't think one has to reach too far. How much more time do I have? About that. Okay. I think finally, I agree with you completely that a purely civic account of liberal democracy is too thin to hold a liberal democracy, and certainly ours, together. What do you do if you don't have a formal establishment and the informal establishment has collapsed? I think that's the question we have to wrestle with seriously, and here is my answer. I think a sense of a shared history must now substitute for a sense of a shared theology. I think we need to focus on our history and the mixture of good and bad that it contains. In my reading of American public opinion, we are ready for that kind of integration of a history honestly told into our civic tradition. I don't think that yearning for a restoration of religious unity in any form is a serious possibility under current circumstances. It will not happen. It cannot happen. We need an alternative, and I'm just giving you mine.
Thou canst not escape theology so easily. Or how will this religious history, how will this shared history be interpreted? Absent a moral and metaphysical framework to make sense of it. I think I didn't agree with everything Professor Mitchell said in the last session, but I thought the framing of, the distinctive current progressive reading of American history as a, particular variation / deformation of Christian moral theology is, it's not the whole story there, it's a big part of the story. And when we're arguing about history, we are inevitably arguing in part about moral premises and also not just premises of what was right and wrong that was done in the past, but also how we should think about those issues in terms of mercy, forgiveness, restitution, and so on today. So that would be my sort of counterpoint, but then I agree with you insofar as I also struggle to see how, again, not a, established, not a singular established church of any sort, but even just a kind of, sort of semi-coherent ecumenical religious center can be restored right now. It seems very, very challenging. I think, to take the sort of, one problem is that historically, I would say that the Protestant tendency in American life sort of occupied the center, and the Emersonian tendency occupied the interesting peripheries. And now the Emersonian tendency is closer to the center, and the more orthodox Christian perspectives are on the peripheries. But the Emersonian tendency is, by its nature, extremely anti-institutional. That's a problem. It's better at institutionalizing it along more Nietzschean lines. So I'd much rather live under sort of, de-institutionalized Emersonianism than institutionalized Nietzscheanism. But it's still a problematic place to locate your religious center. I don't know if that can sort of develop a more institutional form. I'm doubtful. But then the alternative, a recovery of not a sort of, Christian society exactly, but a kind of Christian center seems daunting, in part precisely because if we're doing, if we think about it as we have a national story, in our national story, our religious history starts out and is foundationally Protestant. And that Protestantism, the foundational Protestantism of our republic, is incredibly weak. And, as a Protestant Catholic to Catholicism, I'm in no position to urge its reconstitution. But my Catholic friends who, have a goal of sort of rebuilding an American religious center on sort of a Catholic foundation just have a really daunting task ahead of them, which I am, much more sympathetic to than you are, but I have a hard time seeing how exactly it can come to pass. So on that note, I'll stop and thank you. Yeah.
So please wait for the mic to ask your question and please stand up.
So many words.
Professor.
Thank you very much to all three panelists for a very insightful talk. But I wanted to add two questions I'll try to make very quickly. But I liked a lot of the policy suggestions, that you made, and said there are certain remedies that we have with local democracy, and I definitely agree with those. I think that is the way forward. But isn't it a certain lack of imagination to say that the only alternatives to liberal democracy are, fascism or communism or these other things, authoritarianism that you seem to suggest? Isn't there a sort of, you could say, you could reorganize society on Aristotelian principles of the good as opposed to rights or something like this? It just seems like of course I think practically, yes, the alternative will probably be what you suggested, but theoretically, you said you weren't opposed to imagined republics, so I was just sort of curious on that regard. Is there a lack of imagination? Do you really think it's just a straw man? That will practically is probably what it will lead to, what you suggested, but isn't that really a serious alternative that isn't been thought of? And then for Ross and Matt as well, I really liked your comments a lot, and again, to the comments about whether it's Catholicism or Nietzsche. I mean, couldn't it be said that I think what young people are saying is maybe what Nietzsche talked about as the last man, and they see a certain lack of nobility, and they want a certain nobility, or they want to see something, like when you can't go visit your grandmother who's dying in the hospital or something like this, and they see a real lack of human experience or human life, and they see Catholicism or Nietzsche. Of course, there are other alternatives, but that's maybe why they're attracted to it.
Are there none?
I do.
I mean, at the end of your comments, you suggest there's a kind of felt lack of space for a certain kind of spiritedness, and of course that's just what I was arguing. And I don't know if we could pull back some from the kind of holy war against the male, because I think it's in particular kind of felt problem for young men, which feeds some of the political energies that end up on the alt-right. But I think we've actually been seeing a kind of reckoning of feminism and some of its more misandric tendencies. And I hope that continues, because that I think would go a fair way toward addressing some of the kind of psychosocial pent-up energy that can get politicized.
Well, two brief comments. One to Matt and the other to the question posed to me. Thumos is double-sided. Yes, it can reveal. It also can distort. Do you see the world clearly when you're angry? It depends. Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. I went through much of the same education that you did, and so I'm acquainted with the three parts of the soul, and to some extent with the liberal effort to take out the middle and reduce politics to reason and interest. That's a familiar story, and I think there is some merit to the idea of reimagining and to some extent reinstating and relegitimating that missing middle. But there are reasons why Hobbes was so critical of aristocratic pride, right? It can disrupt. It can turn into a form of destructive selfishness. So, 1.5 cheers for the Thumotic virtues, but not 3.
Sure. I mean, C.S. Lewis, in that fantastic essay, Men Without Chests, says that the spiritedness has to be, it's essentially affect and judgment have to be joined into a kind of capacity to apprehend things accurately. And I think that sort of logos and thumos, essentially. And that thumos has to be trained into a moral order, sort of schedule of the noble and the base, the praiseworthy and the shameful. And these vary across cultures. They're not simply natural, they're inflected by the character of the regime. So what I was trying to suggest is that a hypertrophy of the Hobbesian project, I think sort of final efflorescence is what this looks like to me, is a flattening of that capacity, which, as the words come out of my mouth, it seems like a strange thing to say in a time of such untempered political rage. But I think in part the rage is, I don't know, maybe a kind of a response to that project.
You anticipated my objection. So, but now to the question. My second book, published, God save me, 42 years ago, was entitled Justice and the Human Good. And it was an effort to do exactly what you're recommending. Take Aristotle seriously as a partial corrective to some of the blindness and limitations of liberal democracy. I am very sympathetic to that project to this day. But that doesn't represent an expansion of the fundamental political alternatives now before us. It is one way of improving, and making richer one of the alternatives before us. But the choice, I believe, is, as I stated, unless someone can come up with additional options that are viable in the world as we now find it.
Very, very quickly, on the question of the attractions, extremes, if you will, yes, I think issues of nobility and thumos and aspiration have something to do with it. But I think it's also a question of coherence. I think that to a lot of people, sort of full Nietzsche and full Tridentine Catholicism seem to offer coherent pictures of the universe in which the moral and metaphysical and political sort of fit together much more completely than many of the competing alternatives in the landscape right now. And that's not to say that each of them offer worldviews where everything fits together perfectly. Anyone familiar with debates within Roman Catholicism knows that that's not completely true. But I do think, so especially sort of before the Great Awakening, the rise of identity politics, whatever you want to call it, right? We definitely had a liberalism that was sort of intent on trying to sustain a kind of thin version of Christian morality around issues of equality above all, but connected to a kind of empty metaphysical horizon. And I do think that combination is fundamentally incoherent. And therefore, you should expect, if that is your endpoint, some other development. I think the more moralistic and sort of identity-driven politics on the left right now is one such reaction. I think a turn towards, the sort of, paganism or Christianity, if you will, is another possible reaction. And if I were going to say something more optimistic about the possibility for a revival of a sort of, let's call it a monotheistic center, I do think that, monotheism writ large as a capacious category is just a lot more coherent than its competitors, even if most people at Yale University would disagree with me right now.
Very quick comment. Coherence is an intellectual virtue. It's not necessarily a political virtue. We have to be aware of the difference. Many compromises in politics are incoherent, but necessary and even productive.
Can I intervene at this point? I suppose it's a good thing that on the last panel we finally arrive somewhat closer to where I think we actually are politically. That is to say, due to the manifest explanatory and technological power of our natural science, wasn't it inevitable, sooner or later, that huge swaths of authority would be turned over to an expert elite over whom the ordinary citizen can have no possible authority, who will make decisions the grounds and bases of which cannot be made plain to the ordinary citizen. The ordinary citizen is then in a situation where he or she cannot understand the rules by which they live and where those rules have come from. Meanwhile, they're being told that they are self-governing and that they've made these decisions themselves. When these decisions impinge upon their lives or do not deliver manifest goods to them, they become very angry and frustrated and bewildered, susceptible to conspiracy theories of all different kinds. How will liberal democracy, how can liberal democracy handle the problem of the ascent of the intellectual authority of modern science and the now increasing dominance in our lives of modern technology? Do we not, or are we not fated to live in what Neil Postman called a technopoly, in which sooner or later all other sources of authority recede into insignificance, or as he says, irrelevance?
So I would say that scenario seemed, that fate seemed more likely in certain ways 20 years ago, and that the failures, precisely the failures that Bill, frankly, only began to elaborate, of those experts over the last 20 years mean that their authority is just going to be contested over any near-term time horizon that I can imagine. So the claim, I went to college 1998 to 2002, and the claim in 1999 was that we had experts who knew how to manage the global economy. And you, ordinary citizen, this was all too sophisticated and complex for you to manage that. No ordinary citizen has to believe that anymore, because the experts manifestly did not know how to manage the global economy. Even unto the current bout of inflation that we're experiencing now, that wasn't supposed to be possible because the experts had corrected their prior mistakes, right? So similarly with the internet. The internet in the time of the Obama campaign in 2008 and the Arab Spring and so on was seen as this sort of irresistible force that was leading to inevitable forms of political progress, and that therefore, of course you should let the guys in Silicon Valley run their companies because they were delivering obvious, massive global public goods. Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter were going to bring down authoritarian regimes the world over. Nobody believes that anymore. And so the internet is itself a zone of political contest with, the sort of one faction of technocracy trying to assert control over another faction. What is the quest of the Biden administration and prominent Democrats to bring the internet to heel is a battle within the technocracy between DC technocrats and Silicon Valley people, right? Like that battle, that's just sort of a crack, a fissure within the expert class itself. I could go on, but I think there may come another moment where I think the problem that you're identifying is a problem insofar as the populist critics of technocracy, by virtue of being sort of excluded and outside the expert systems, don't know what to do when they take power. That is a real problem. But their ability to contest the power of the technological elite, I think, has grown apace in my political lifetime. Go ahead.
So I'm very grateful for this, because what I would have added is that we oscillate between a sort of incoherent and politically ineffectual rage against the technocratic elite, which will almost surely deliver bad outcomes, and then we oscillate back in the direction, but meanwhile, with a ratcheting effect, I would argue. So I don't know.
I wonder, as you initially laid it out, the premise is that societies become so complex that it must be governed by experts for reasons that the ordinary citizen can't possibly understand. And yet, all the failures that Bill, again, merely started listing. I mean, there's a kind of epistemic modesty that has been very much not in evidence in the sort of technocratic organs, and it doesn't seem to be any way to gain it. I mean, just failure after failure seems to have little effect. Is there, and I'm just thinking out loud, is there some way to kind of rehabilitate kind of the presence of a widely distributed kind of commonsensical approach to some of these problems? Because I often think that, for example, with COVID, it would have been possible to lay out sort of different courses of action and what their possible upsides and downsides have been in a way that is intelligible to people, and then make it a sort of explicitly political decision that leaders would sort of own as such, rather than hiding behind, follow the science, which was just an evasion of just that responsibility.
Fair enough.
Can I just interject for just a second with my own question over here, holistic democracy debate, which is that, on one hand, I'm a libertarian, so I'm very sympathetic to this idea of top-down, critique of top-down management and all the mistakes that the various administrations have made that we laid out. On the other hand, I come from India, where the kind of rage we are seeing against technocratic mismanagement seems to be reserved for, phenomena like political corruption, which are actually absent in, at least at the national level in politics in the United States. You don't see that kind of political corruption, which is usually the stuff of populist outrage. I mean, the worst technocratic mistake that we made was, financial crisis and the mishandling of the bailouts and what have you. That's nothing compared to what Modi did when one fine evening he decided he was going to demonetize 90% of the currency. Those kinds of technocratic mistakes don't happen in a liberal democracy, and actually have not happened over here. So I'm still struggling to understand this, this sort of like this level of rage that we are witnessing in the United States, and it doesn't seem to me that technocratic mismanagement actually gets to the heart of the issue.
It doesn't, and if I tell you what, I will send you the chapter of the book I'm writing called The Dark Passions, which include anger, humiliation, resentment, and fear. I'll send you the resentment chapter. Maybe that will help. But let me just make, if I may, an Aristotelian point that I hope will make the questioner feel a little bit better. There has been a lot of chatter in recent decades to the effect that portions of our lives have spun free of political control, whether it's the global economy, whether it's technology, whatever. Ultimately, that proposition is wrong in every instance. In the end, politics is overarching. It is the queen of the sciences, and globalization can be disrupted and has been disrupted by political decisions, including decisions about war and peace. Technology is in the process of being interrogated not only by angry populists, but also by public officials. Matt, you just testified before a committee that would not have been seized of this issue even 5 years ago. And so I guess what I'm saying is that ultimately public antipathy and rage over the defects of expertise give way to a politics that tries to make sense of that rage and turn it into something productive. And let me give you just one anecdote. In 1962, I heard John F. Kennedy. I was seated on the lawn, of the Yale commencement ceremony. I heard John F. Kennedy give his speech in which he announced that the age of ideology is gone once and for all, and that the only issue now before liberal democracy was the management of the economy and society through processes and theories that were now adequately understood. So we could fine-tune our way out of all of our difficulties. I don't need to tell you what happened next. That thesis is always wrong in the long run, even if it seems to be true in the short run. And what that tells me is that American politics goes through phases where the conventional understanding is more or less adequate to the situation, to new realities in which the conventional understanding is not. There's a period of elite confusion and popular discontent, and then, I don't mean to sound too Hegelian about this, at some point, our democratic institutions are competent enough, to find a new way forward in the face of new realities and new difficulties. I think in every major religion, hope is, despair is a sin. And I think it's a political sin as well. We should not succumb to it. There's nothing inevitable about any of this.
I have an observation which I suppose is a kind of objection, but in a way it's an objection to things that I myself said on the first night. So I was kind of struck by the sense that maybe this is a caricature, but I got the sense that you sort of all were thinking, if we could go back 30 years, 40 years, more or less we had it all, and that what we're now seeing are these problems of divisiveness, of extremism, of technocracy rising up, and of wokeness, and all of this. But it seems to me that, I just happen to have been recently rereading Solzhenitsyn's Harvard address, which was, I think, 78. And there was a much more basic objection to liberalism than our more recent problems of it spinning off divisiveness or leading to technocratic domination or spinning off wokeness or whatever. But that there was just a spiritual hole at the center of liberalism. And I wonder if, and so that, and it seems to me that's the most serious difficulty. And so turning the clock back 30 years doesn't address that difficulty. And to some extent it seems to me some of these more recent problems, these recent pathologies may be even traceable to that as a deeper cause, because they're in some sense responses to that. Not necessarily healthy responses, but they can be seen as rebellions against that. So anyways, what about that? Because it seems to me that, I don't know quite how to put it as a question, it's more an observation, but I'll just turn it over to you to respond to the observation.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I do think that's, that is part of my diagnosis, that liberalism, maybe it's not exactly what Solzhenitsyn's reading, because I think it's fair to say he was to my right in some important respects. But generally, I think that liberalism, as we've noted in the United States, Europe is a somewhat different case, has depended on a strong religious culture that dissolved in certain important ways with the social revolutions of the 60s and 70s. And our politics since has not become secularized, but it's been characterized by spiritual and religious energies in search of forms and institutions capable of channeling them more effectively. So in that sense, I guess, since I'm not an ecumenical Protestant, I don't actually want to go back to that world, but I do think there was a shift in the life of liberalism, if you will, in that era that we are still living with the after effects. I will speak up on behalf, though, of the late 1990s as, relatively speaking, a pretty good time. The movies were really good. The internet, I actually think, I think the era, the immediate pre-internet era was a positive one in certain ways. I think the, Galstonian liberalism.
He was in the White House.
Was in full flower.
It was a really boring
There had been
time.
I think
really good in retrospect.
I think, productivity growth was the only period since the 60s when productivity growth went way up, if you just want to be a crude econometrician. So I think you can make a case for a little bit of late 90s nostalgia here and there. Yeah.
Well, I think Devin's point is well taken. This nostalgia is for a moment frozen in time that maybe was not sustainable given the sort of spiritual vacuum, which is now being filled, as Josh Mitchell laid out, by these highly distorted twists, sort of Gnostic transformations of Christianity.
Well, I have to say that I'll try to take the edge off the comment I'm about to utter. But I have it from a good source. I think the spiritual emptiness thesis is the night in which all cows are black. It simultaneously explains too much and too little. I am not nostalgic for the 1990s. I very much subscribe to Ross's sympathetic description of the Clinton administration, and I think it deserves that encomium and more. I'll be happy to deliver it at more time. I think that the bipartisan effort to integrate China into the global economy on terms that were highly unfavorable to American workers explains a lot more of our current ills than the thesis of the spiritual void does. But let me say something a little deeper in response to that. What does it say about politics that we expect to gain our sense of spiritual meaning from it? I think that's a deep mistake, right? And any effort to collapse the distinction between the meaning from politics and the meaning from religion, or family life, or other deep commitments, including the sorts of philosophical inquiry that many members of this room engaged in, that asks too much of politics, and we are bound to be bitterly disappointed when politics doesn't deliver that. And I think that all positions of the social Nietzschean type suffer from that fatal flaw, and that if we retract our ambitions for politics and recognize that an important part of the meaning in our lives will come from other sources, we won't be a lot better off.
Unless it's precisely the crisis of spiritual meaning that drives people to seek meaning from politics.
And also, David Levy made an important argument yesterday that if politics gives up on the sources of higher meaning, it inevitably hollows out those sources. It's more difficult for those sources to maintain themselves without political support.
I just don't accept that argument. I think, and let me offer a positive suggestion. One of the things that our response to Ukraine has opened up is the possibility not so much of a politics of meaning in the deep spiritual sense, but a politics organized around an inspiring national purpose, and that is the defense of democracy at home and abroad. If we took that seriously as the organizing principle of our politics, I think many of our current divisions would be subsumed under a shared commitment to do what our response to Ukraine reveals we all believe in. Now, there are going to be big arguments at the margins of that commitment, but I think the end of the Cold War opened the door to a phenomenon that is misdiagnosed as a spiritual void and is more correctly diagnosed as the end of a national sense of mission and purpose, which can to some extent be restored through new political commitments, which I believe ought to be made.
I have to respond to that because something very much like that was the noise made by the Bush administration in going going to Iraq. And I have an anecdote in the works making the world safe for democracy. So before 9/11, I had just finished my degree. I was poking around Washington looking for a job. I ended up talking to this guy, Gary Schmidt, who ran something called the Project for the New American Century. This was before 9/11. These guys were itching for some war on the premise that we needed some American greatness. We needed our souls to be brought up from this bourgeois masked man condition. Sure enough, along comes 9/11, and you know the rest. So I really appreciated what you said, the penultimate thing you said, namely placing hopes in politics is a recipe for disaster. But the sort of, there's a neocon temptation toward international intervention, I think can be described as just that.
Well, I speak as an early fervent opponent of the Iraq War, with, I think, no part of my soul that responded to that particular recommendation. I also am speaking as someone who spent 9 years on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy and was inspired by the way in which the United States could be, in a peaceful way, a force for good. And we had a lot to do, the National Endowment for Democracy had a lot to do with the positive developments that emerged after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think there's a distinction between promoting democracy through war, which I'm not in favor of, and preserving democracy where it is, which may on occasion require American force. For example, I doubt very much that Xi Jinping wants to end his presidency without the reacquisition of Taiwan, which can only be brought about by force. And I believe that an America that stood against that as part of a broader mission, to defend what we believe to be best, would be a worthy project. And not at all an itch. The fact that the Bush administration got democracy wrong doesn't mean that a concern for democracy per se is wrong beyond our borders as well as within.
This is a question for any of you, but I think especially for Ross. We've been talking a lot about populist energies and technocratic elites, and we haven't said very much about statesmanship. Can we solve our problems without statesmanship? What is it, and why do we have so little of it?
No. Tough question. Tougher question. No, maybe not. No, it's the middle question that's the hardest. It's sort of, the middle question is sort of a you know it when you see it kind of thing. The first question, basically one of my pet theories of American derangement is that the American political system is designed to assume and reward a certain kind of majoritarian statesmanship in presidential leaders. That if you look at especially the history of the 20th century United States, our politics was characterized repeatedly by highly effective politicians, presidents, who built large, not always stable, but usually substantial governing majorities, who polarized the country but made sure that they had by far the bigger side. And something that has happened in our politics basically since the Reagan era is the failure of parties and their leaders to build and sustain those kind of coalitions. And it's not, obviously there are deep structural forces driving this, changing organization and shape of the parties, the changing media environment, and sort of increased efficiency in campaigning even, right? Where you just don't have campaigns that leave millions of votes on the table and end up losing the way Goldwater did, in 60, right? I mean, a lot of the campaigns that lost by 20 percentage points in early 20th century are just shambolic, right? In hindsight, that doesn't happen anymore. Even the Trump campaign and its sort of shambolic side in 2016 ended up finding and exploiting various efficiencies, and obviously partisan polarization is much powerful force. Anyway, I could go on. But I do think that, it's not a full solution to our many problems, but one necessary part of any solution is having political parties and political leaders who figure out how to play for at least 55% majorities. Again, 60% majority is probably out of reach in this environment. But the goal of a 55% majority should be the starting place of any national politician who aspires to lead us beyond the age of polarization, and that requires statesmanship. And the essence of statesmanship is, in this case, is a mix of it's arts of persuasion, reassurance, coalition building, the capacity to make people who don't vote for you feel some degree of trust in you so that they might consider voting for you in the future, or not be constantly pressuring their neighbors not to vote for you, and so on. I don't think that part of the challenge is that the system that produces would-be leaders in a polarized environment, and this sort of populist versus meritocrats environment is just not set up to produce leaders who can sort of see beyond their particular bases. I think in certain ways what the United States needs right now is a new and doubtless very different Charles de Gaulle, right? Someone who is capable of creating some of this, the kind of historical narratives that you're talking about, saying like, here is what we are absorbing into the national narrative, and here on the left or the right is what we are excluding and leaving out. And at the end of that storytelling exercise, putting some hard power politics behind it. Unfortunately, we don't happen to have any leaders who heroically led American resistance from a foreign capital while our country was occupied by the Nazis. So where that kind of figure would come from, I'm not at all sure. But it's, Donald Trump never even made an attempt to get beyond 48 to 49% of the country. And the Democratic coalitions of the last few presidencies, apart from the unique case of Obama in 2008, have been sort of content with sort of their 49 to 51%. And I fear that the Democrat, as a conservative, I guess I hope, but for the country, I fear that the Democrats are now in a position where they're going to sink to 46% without having planned to find their way back. So anyway, yes, clearly some form of political leadership has a power that we're not tapping into at the moment.
This is a note of great agreement. Let me just add a political science footnote to what Ross just said. I actually, as part of an article I recently published, did a study of all the presidential elections in the past 100 years. And they divide neatly into two parts. In part one, which lasted from 1920 to 1984, presidential victories of at least 10 percentage points or more were the norm, and landslide victories of 20 percentage points or more occurred in a substantial fraction of the elections, 17 elections that were conducted during that period. I think the number is either 4 or 5. It was a lot bigger than 0. Since 1984, not a single presidential victor has gotten close even to 10%. We are not only a deeply divided country, we are a closely divided country. And those two fundamental facts about contemporary politics interact, right? Where polarization simultaneously deepens the conflict between the parties and also makes it more difficult to break out of this pattern of close elections which resolve nothing for very long. An additional political science fact. I actually, indulged my nerdish side and added up all the votes that were cast for members of Congress for the two-party.
On an average.
On average, absolutely. During the past 9 elections. Well, all of the cycles since 1984. Votes for Democratic House candidates, 51%. Votes for Republican House candidates, 49%. This has been a period of unprecedented, at least recently, oscillation of party control of both the House and the Senate, after an extended period in which there were dominant majorities on one side or the other. And very good political scientists have traced the perverse consequences for everything that we're talking about, including the resurgence of statesmanship, of the closeness, the closeness of the majority and the minority, and the regular oscillation between the two parties in control of the White House and also in control of the Congress, which does not lead people to think big. Au contraire, you're battling, and it makes it very difficult for you to do anything conciliatory towards the other side that might give them a measure of credit for something good, because if you do, that might improve their standing by 1 or 2 percentage points, and that would be the difference between victory and defeat. So, to quote a forbidden philosopher, only a God can save us.
So that has to be the last word.